Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. 2 weeks ago, we had ice and snow on the ground, and now it's 72 degrees outside. Pretty crazy. Well, we are continuing in the unit that's called Owning a Faith That Matters. We're in the third lesson called Expectant Faith. The focal passage is out of Luke chapter 8. We're going to be looking at verses 41 through 42 and then skipping down to 49 through 56, even though I am going to include those in between verses. And the point of this lesson is faith maintains trust in God to do what no one else can do. Well, let's first review what we've studied so far in this unit. The first lesson was called Life-Changing Faith. It dealt with Jesus' teaching, his teaching the multitude from Peter's, or Simon at that time, from Simon's boat. We looked at the great haul of fish, and then the call on Peter's life to follow Jesus. And I may not have mentioned this in the prep talk, but the Zebedee Fishing Company, it was stationed in Capernaum. Now, the second lesson in the unit was called Yielded Faith. That was what we had last week, and it was about the healing of the Roman centurion servant. This week's lesson is about a man named Jairus. You've probably noticed that verses 43 through 48 are not included in this lesson, and that's because the story of Jairus is interrupted by the story of the woman with the issue of blood. So I'm going to include those verses 43 through 48, in my lesson this week because it goes right along with the theme of expectant faith. I'm also going to start the lesson in verse 40, one verse earlier, instead of verse 41, because it contains the main word that ties in with our lesson title. So let's begin with Luke chapter 8, verse 40 through 42. Here Jesus is returning to Capernaum, and he had a welcoming committee waiting for him because why? They were expecting him. Now, remember, that's the lesson title, Expectant Faith. All right, now, at this point here, we're also introduced to Jairus. Now, we only know a few things about this man, just from these few verses. He was a synagogue leader. He had a 12-year-old daughter who was deathly ill, and he was desperate for her to be healed. You know, it's amazing what desperate people will do. Sometimes desperation leads people to do things they never thought they would or even could do. So let's examine Jairus' desperation for just a bit. He was a leader in the local synagogue. That meant that he was an elder. He was in charge of services in the facilities. He lined up people to pray, to read scripture, and deliver the sermon. He cared for those sacred scrolls that was there in that building. He oversaw the benevolence. The leader was usually a man of wealth and good reputation in the community. He was used to being in charge. And for the most part, religious leaders weren't that fond of Jesus. And we can't say for certain if Jairus originally felt any animosity toward Jesus or not. But it wouldn't be out of the question to assume that. This man had wealth and community and religious status, so he was a man who was always in control of situations. But he now found himself in a predicament that he had no control over. His little girl was dying. He abandoned all pride and possible ostracization and not only approached Jesus, but fell at his feet. He just didn't invite Jesus over. He pleaded with him to come to his house. So Jesus went with him. He went toward Jairus' house. And the crowds were pressing in on him, almost crushing him. And here's where we can mention something that ties into previous lessons. You know, it's always good to tie the current lesson, if you can, back to previous lessons and reinforce the learning over the weeks. A question to ask would be, just in these few verses that we've read so far, do you see any similarities between this lesson and the previous two lessons that we've had in this unit? Here are some similarities that I see. Now, comparing this week's lesson to the very first, both were said in Capernaum, and the crowds were pressing Jesus. Okay? And comparing this week's lesson to last week's, the second in the unit, both were said in Capernaum. Okay? All three of them said in Capernaum. And both this week and last week involved a very sick individual in a home, and Jesus was asked to heal that person. Well, in our lesson this week, Jesus had an interruption along the way, and that's where we pick up the story that was interjected here in the text in Luke 8:43 through 48. And this is the story of the woman with an issue of blood. The faith of this woman is also an expectant faith. She just expressed it differently than Jairus. The parallel account of the story is in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34, and it gives a little bit more detail about this occurrence. She most likely had some type of uterine or menstrual disorder. And not only was this had to be uncomfortable and probably painful, but she was in a constant state of ceremonial uncleanliness. Just like Leviticus 15, verses 25 through 27 explains, her physical condition was compounded by the social and the religious ramifications. So anyone who touched her, or those whom she touched, even their clothes, would be ceremonially unclean as well. So more than likely she was, and this is just Jim's opinion here, that she was not a native of Capernaum, because if she were, anyone who knew her would dare not get close to her. But even with the crowds almost crushing him, somehow this unnamed woman made her way to be near Jesus. And the Mark 5 passage tells us that she spent everything she had on doctors with no results, and she thought that she could just touch his clothes, then she would be healed. She was a desperate woman in a seemingly hopeless situation. She could have given up. Right? There's a number of excuses she could have used. Nothing's worked for 12 years. There's too many people. If I even get close enough to Jesus, I don't know if I can. He's too busy. Why would he mess with somebody like me? And the list can go on and on. But she didn't give up. She was defiled. She was desperate. But she was also determined. But here's the question: why not just request an audience with Jesus, as Jairus had done? Well, for one, she would probably be embarrassed to admit what her situation was. And possibly she was afraid that Jesus, now here's a Jewish rabbi, would scold her for mixing in the crowd in her condition. But somehow she was able to make her way through the crowd and get close enough to Jesus where she could reach out and touch the edge of his cloak. Now in Bible times, the cloak was an outer garment. It was a wide vest, no sleeves, and it went down all the way down to the person's ankles. It's also called a robe or a mantle. And she didn't have Jesus lay hands on her. She didn't have Jesus speak a word of healing over her. She just wanted to touch his cloak, and she thought she'd be healed. And that's what happened. As soon as she touched the cloak of Jesus, she was immediately healed. The Mark 5 passage tells us that she felt the healing immediately take place in her body. And Jesus felt it too. He asked the question, "Who touched me?" Now, we might think that's kind of an odd question for a couple of reasons. First, okay, here's Jesus, the Son of God. Doesn't he know everything? Okay. Now, I believe this wasn't a question of inquiry to obtain knowledge, but to make the woman identify herself. Kind of like God in the garden, where he asks Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" Okay, he knows where they are. He's just wanting them to admit where they are. All right. If she had been allowed to slither away somehow in the crowd, she wouldn't have received this verbal blessing from Jesus. Another reason that this is an odd question is because that there was a crowd pressing around him. Lots of people were touching him or pressing into him. And Peter even told him that very fact. And yes, there were a lot of people around him and pressing into him, but there was only one who was touching him in faith to be healed. Don't you think that's what's true in a lot of our churches? There are a lot of people who are pressing around Jesus. They're in proximity to him. They're getting a Jesus experience without really experiencing Jesus. They maybe enjoy the music and the sermon, and it makes them feel temporarily good, but they don't allow it to change them. And how sad that is. Well, the woman held out as long as she could before identifying herself. She was trembling, and then she publicly admitted why she was there and why she had reached out to touch Jesus. And then Jesus called the woman something that he's not recorded saying to anyone else. He called her daughter. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Now, let's get back to the story of Jairus, the main story for the day. Let's now look at Luke 8:49 through 53. And just as Jesus was talking to the woman, Someone came from Jairus' home to tell Jairus that his daughter had died. There is no need for Jesus to come to the home. You know that Jairus had to think that if Jesus hadn't stopped to have this exchange with this unclean woman, then his little girl might still be alive. Because what can be done after a person dies? That's the end, isn't it? Now, that's very similar to the story of Lazarus' first death, recorded in John 11, verses 1 through 43. Jesus was told that Lazarus was very ill. But Jesus waited 2 days before going to Bethany, where Lazarus was already dead and buried. And when Martha saw Jesus approaching their home, she said that if Jesus had been there, if he'd been here, my brother Lazarus wouldn't have died. But Jesus raised him from the dead, didn't he? That wasn't the end for Lazarus. But Lazarus' rising from the dead occurred after our story today, okay? And in the previous chapter, back in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, Jesus raised a widow's son from the dead. But that was about 20 miles away from Capernaum, as we can see on this map here. And it appears that this was the first recorded instance of Jesus raising someone from the dead. Verse 17 says that the news about Jesus spread throughout the land. But we're not sure if the news had reached Jairus and Capernaum yet. Jesus heard the report of the 12-year-old girl's death, but he was not discouraged by it. He said, "Don't be afraid, just believe and she'll be healed." He arrived at Jairus' house and only allowed his inner 3 disciples, Jairus and Mrs. Jairus, to go in. And Jesus told the mourner, "Stop mourning. She's only sleeping." And what was their response? They laughed. Sleeping? There's no way. She's dead. She was alive a little bit ago, yeah, but she's definitely dead now. This rabbi, this traveling preacher, obviously didn't know the difference between sleep and death. What a rube is this guy. But guess what? Jesus used that same terminology in the passage on Lazarus' death that we see over in John 11 through 13. And here's something else. Do you know what I find interesting? The name Jairus means he will awaken. How's that for irony? Now, our last set of verses is in Luke 8, 54 through 56. Jesus took the little girl by the hand, and as Mark 5:41 records, Jesus said the Aramaic phrase, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Verse 55 in our passage states that her spirit returned, indicating that she was indeed dead. And to prove that she just wasn't revived but healed, Jesus ordered that she be given something to eat. This wouldn't only provide nourishment to the child, but it was also show those doubters that she was indeed restored to her pre-illness condition. And then Jesus told the parents not to tell anyone what had happened. Now, just a few verses back, Luke 8:39, he told the man who was delivered from a legion of demons to go and share what God had done for him. But here, he demanded the parents not to tell. So why is that? Why allow one person to tell about the miraculous thing that's happened and tell another to keep quiet? Well, really, we can only speculate, but honestly, we don't know. I believe each case was unique, and Jesus knew where it was okay for this information to spread and where it might be dangerous or detrimental to his ministry. Because you go back to Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, and it tells the story of Jesus healing a man with leprosy. And he gave the healed man a strict warning not to tell anyone. And verse 45 says this. It says, instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. So, yes, Jesus performed many miracles. He healed many people, but that was a secondary reason for his being here on earth. His primary mission was to preach the good news of forgiveness, redemption, and salvation. When folks heard about Jesus' miracles, of course they came from all over to be touched by the healer. And we've seen that in our stories in this unit, that there were so many people, they crowded him to the point of almost crushing him. Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood, they both had an expectant faith. They expected Jesus to heal. And as the point of this lesson states, faith maintains trust in God to do what no one else can do. What is it you're trusting God for? For something that only He can provide. It might be a good question to ask the class. It could be a healing, like we talked about in the story, or it could be maybe to mend a severed relationship that there doesn't seem to be any hope of ever getting those folks back together. Invite your class to share something that's too big for them to handle, that they need God's intervention, and then pray for those situations. Well, next week we're going to continue in our next set of lessons. We're going to be in Luke chapter 11, and we're going to examine the topic of praying faith. And speaking of praying, don't forget to pray for and with your class. Thank you guys so much for watching.